The way I'm going to take this subject is to carefully make a definition first, and it may be helpful to have the lights dimmed at this point. Thank you very much. We need to realize that many people might get confused on the definition of evolution. I'm taking evolution to mean a huge, grand picture of mud to men, basically. You know, molecules to people, and protons to prime ministers and all the other P's that you can put in there. You know, I should have said molecules to melons, I guess. But basically, it's the big jump that people are arguing for. I quite realize that there is variation. We're more than familiar with that. Creationists have no problem, you'll see, with that point. We're saying, from the creationist point of view, that scientific experiment indicates that the above is not true, that codes and order come from intelligence, which is going to be my last point. Evolution, then, I'm taking not as something to do with small variations that you might see, and we do see, within groups of creatures, or even in tiny creatures in the laboratory. But that's not what we're referring to here by evolution, not the way I'm using it. Evolution we're taking as primitive life forms come to people by natural selection. I'll come to natural selection later, but just so you understand my definition here. I take a design point of view as a creationist. I'm going to show you that it's perfectly sensible to take that it's not off the wall, that it's actually a very positive position, and it encourages good research, which is often the argument posed against us. Complex earlier kinds, dogs, cats, humans, and all the others, we've got here, yes, with natural selection. Notice I've got it in both definitions, giving variety. We'll come to natural selection later. And I will pinpoint what I mean by natural selection. So just hold that, park that if you're worried by that point. We will come to it. I'm going to consider macro design. I'm going to consider intricate mechanisms. And then lastly, I will consider information. Macro design will consider bird flight and breathing. So I often do a talk on flight, but I won't be doing my whole talk, but I'll just pick out one or two aspects of it. Birds are really very impressive in their prowess and the way they can fly through the air, and often been an inspiration to many. Birds, of course, have light bones, which is essential. Their bones are hollow. They're not structured like land creatures like ourselves or reptiles on land. People try and argue that they come from dinosaurs, and that might be true, although I should point out that it's been found that there are some bird tracks in rock which somehow doesn't quite fit their argument, which says that dinosaurs gradually changed into birds. I would suggest to you that there are some embarrassing finds in the rocks which would negate that argument. But even if you were just for a moment to accept it, and I don't, but even if you were to accept it, you would still have a problem in saying, where do the hollow bones come from, which actually are vital for the structure of a bird, and where, I'm going to come to in a moment, does the breathing mechanism come from for birds, which is totally different to reptiles. When you look at the skeleton of a bird, the bird has a very carefully put together skeleton which enables it to mount into the air. One of the important points about birds is that it has this very strong breastbone, and it is a sternum bone. That's the proper name for this bone. And if I just show you on the screen so you can see it, you can see here that there is the sternum bone here, which we call it the keel of the sternum bone at that point. Now that bone structure is coupled with a muscle mechanism which actually is essential for flight. If you try and do what a bird does, you'll find that it's exceedingly difficult. A bird, if you were to bend over, simulating what a bird's torso is doing, a bird actually moves its wings way back, and it's moving its humerus bone right high up. And we can't do that because we only have one muscle, whereas birds have an extra muscle, which is vital. They have the major muscle, but they also have another muscle which comes right over the top of the humerus bone and does something which we cannot do. It lifts the humerus bone. And this is absolutely essential for birds. Now, this is macro design. People will try and argue against it, saying, well, we believe that this could have come about by random mutations and natural selection operating on it. And I'm well aware of those points. We'll come to those in a moment. But just let's see the magnitude of what's involved. If the theory of evolution is true, it is actually saying that this supracoracoideus muscle, which is the extra muscle that I'm referring to, here's the keeled sternum bone, the breastbone that I refer to. We are saying that this, what is effectively a pulley arrangement, actually all came about with random mutations and natural selection gradually changing something which wasn't there before, growing a supracoracoideus muscle which wasn't even there, making sure, of course, that the bones were hollow as well, which are needed for flight, and that this pulley arrangement pulled the humerus back so that reptiles, whether it was a velociraptor or whatever it is that they say was a precursor to birds, then began to be able to do this movement. If you try and do that movement, you'll find you get exceedingly tired very quickly. But a bird has no problem, because a bird knows how to pull its humerus. Here's the humerus bone. Here's the wing. This is the structure of the wing. Here's the muscle. This is the pectoralis major muscle that all of us have. And here's the blue muscle that I'm referring to, which is the supracoracoideus muscle. Absolutely essential. Just one aspect of birds, the muscle arrangement. Then, what about the breathing arrangement, which is the second aspect of birds that I just want to illustrate the large-scale evidences, which we could look at hundreds of these examples. And I've just chosen two in the area of bird flight. Now, something that people don't realize is that birds breathe in an entirely different way to us. We breathe using lungs, which take the air in, bring it to a dead stop. The oxygen is given from the air into the blood, and the blood gives the carbon dioxide into the air, and then we breathe out again. It's very straightforward, although actually it's not as straightforward, because even lungs, even those sorts of lungs, as soon as they go wrong, you know it. And if you can't breathe, of course, you're dead. But lungs are very essential, but they work very efficiently for land-going creatures. The air is breathed in, and then the air is breathed out. An incredibly efficient system. You need all the vein structure to go with it, and, of course, the arteries as well. Now, we breathe like that, but so do reptiles, which is the supposed precursor to birds. Birds have an entirely different breathing system. If you're an engineer, like I teach engineers, you will know that there is such an arrangement for mass exchange across between air and liquid, which is a most efficient system. If you look up any of the books on heat and mass transfer, and I'm dealing with mass transfer in breathing, you will know as an engineer that the most efficient mass exchanger is always a counterflow mass exchanger, where the liquid goes in one way and the air, in this case, or any gas, goes in the other way. If you have that system where the air is going in one way and the blood, in this case, is going in the other direction, it means that you can get more bang for your buck, to put it crudely. It basically means that you can have the most efficient system using as little weight as possible, because it costs money to build mass exchangers. And the engineering industry knows this, the refrigeration industry, whatever, there's whole vast areas in engineering where we use either heat exchangers or mass exchangers, all right? The bird has the most efficient system. It has a counterflow mass exchanger system. This is putting it in its simplest way. It's actually much more complicated than that. But if you actually peel away all the complexity, at the heart of a bird's breathing system is a counterflow mass exchanger. The tubes are so tiny that if the bird were to stop breathing, you could never reinflate the lung, all right? So if ever you see a bird dying on the ground, don't try and give it artificial respiration because it won't work, okay? Not that anybody would try. The bird would die of a heart attack anyway if you tried. But a bird has a lung system which operates in a different way. The air comes in from left to right, and the blood in my diagram would go from right to left. The blood, as it comes in, is actually taking the oxygen it's giving out the carbon dioxide, and then it's taking in the oxygen from this side as it leaves. So there is never a stopping of motion, and this is the important difference. Our air comes in through bronchial tubes, which then go to alveoli, not ravioli that you eat, alveoli which come then to a dead stop, and the air comes to a dead stop, and as I've already explained, passes over the oxygen to the bloodstream. Whereas in a counterflow system, the air never stops. So then you're going to ask me, well, how does a bird breathe in and out if the lung is constantly passing air through? Is it just going, no, it's not doing that. It's actually doing something incredibly complicated. This is how a bird breathes. This is the diagram of the outer part of the bird. The bird has a series of air sacs. We'll just look at 2 air sacs and the lung to make our point tonight. There's actually more to it than that. Even the bones come into it, which are hollow. It's storing oxygen everywhere, or storing air. Now there's the actual counterflow heat mass exchanger, which is the lung. Now let's follow a packet of air as the bird breathes. You breathe in with me. Right? If you were a bird, that packet of air would have then gone to the rear of the bird. It would have not gone through the lung, all right? The packet of air that you've just breathed in, okay? Now you breathe out, and the packet of air that you've just breathed in goes not out, it goes through the lung, right? And what comes out of the bird is an earlier packet of air, right? Are you with me? Now we breathe in again, and we're following one packet of air, which has now just gone through the lung. Now we breathe in again, and that packet of air that we're following now goes to the front air sac, ready to come out on the next exhalation. So now the bird breathes out again, and that packet of air comes out. So it's a 2-stroke breathing system. Absolutely phenomenal. So it breathes in, it breathes out, goes through the lung, but an earlier packet of air goes in, then breathes in again, and that packet of air goes to the front air sac, and then finally it comes out. Now, when you learn things like that, you say to yourself, just a minute, if evolution is true, a precursor creature, even if you say this was already in some dinosaur, you've still got to say that some reptile before that changed to having this system. Actually, I don't think that's true for a moment. But we'll just give them that argument for a moment. Wherever you put this, I say it's reptiles to birds, which are totally different, and dinosaurs weren't like birds. That's my position. But even if you were to say that some velociraptor-type creature was a precursor, you've got to say, well, what was going on before that to make that creature have this type of air-breathing system, which is totally different to our lung and totally different to its precursor? Well, let's just go through the argument. This is science speak, right? So you'll have to just bear with it. This was written when people were still saying, from the evolutionary point of view, that birds must have been totally different to dinosaurs. Then they've changed their position a bit now, and they're beginning to say in their thinking that dinosaurs some dinosaur-like creature which was going along the ground already had features like a bird. I don't accept that, but that's their position. But the argument would still go for the argument as to what was going on before that creature and this creature which has now got this air-breathing system. So let's just go through it. Recent conventional wisdom, I just see that this has slightly lost its, or a bit fun. Sorry about this. I see we've slightly lost the image. That's better. Recently, conventional wisdom has held that birds are direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs. However, the apparently steadfast maintenance of hepatic piston diaphragmatic lung ventilation in theropods throughout the Mesozoic poses fundamental problems for such a relationship. In other words, they're saying that all the reptiles and creatures before that all seem to have lung arrangements, from what they could see, which are essentially like reptiles today, like crocodiles and other creatures, lizards, which breathe like we do. The earliest stages in the derivation of the avian abdominal air sac system from a diaphragm ventilating ancestor would have necessitated selection for a diaphragmatic hernia in taxa transitional between theropods and birds. Now, I need to interpret what this science speak is saying. It's basically saying that any precursor to this creature, which is now going to breathe differently, would have a problem. Because there's one thing I haven't yet told you. Birds don't have diaphragms. It's just a little problem, isn't it? A bird breathes actually by moving that breastbone that I referred to. The sternum bone acts in exactly the same way as our muscle diaphragm, and lizards and reptiles have exactly the same arrangement. They breathe, reptiles breathe generally, by moving not a breastbone, but by moving a diaphragm, okay? And this is making the important point that if you go from a diaphragm ventilating creature to a creature which no longer is using a diaphragm, but is using this breastbone arrangement, or this sternum bone arrangement, then you've got a diaphragmatic hernia. Well, you know what a hernia is like. I've had a hernia. And those of you who've had hernias know that they are pretty destructive unless something's done about them. And so basically it's saying, in science speak, we'll translate this in a moment, such a debilitating condition would have immediately compromised the entire pulmonary, that means air breathing, ventilatory apparatus, and seems unlikely to be of any selective advantage. You bet. The creature would be dead. You got the point? You can't get round this, friends. You can't have an in-between creature which is still alive, which is a bit of a problem if you're trying to evolve something, because the creature's not surviving. So we need to be aware, friends, that there are fundamental problems. Even from the evolutionary camp, they acknowledge that there are problems. Okay, I said to you that I would make some comments on natural selection. And here's some comments. Will natural selection help? What is natural selection? Well, natural selection is the natural equivalent of artificial selection, or you might say it vice versa. So we need to know what is a selective mechanism. We have no problem with that. There is a selective mechanism. When a farmer wants to breed a Jersey cow, from scratch that is, not that we would probably have to do it now because we always keep a stock of Jersey cows, but supposing we'd lost some Jersey cows and we still got wild ox kind around, we might try to breed until we eventually got something rather like a Jersey cow, which really was brilliant for milk. Now, will you get an Angus cow, which is good for meat, from a Jersey cow? No. You'd have to go back to the wild kind to get it. Natural selection is in exactly the same way, except that it's happening naturally in the environment. That is, the ecological pressures of separation of one group of creatures from another will tend to cause certain characteristics in their descendants to appear rather than other characteristics. And the best illustration is perhaps these dogs here. You could take anything to illustrate this point, but you'll tend to get Siberian long-haired dogs in the cold environments because the selective pressures would then cause this cold environment to favour the creatures which are going to survive more readily in that cold environment, which is the dogs which have longer fur. Okay? Similarly, if you were in a hot country, the long fur will tend to have lots of other creepy crawlies in it and tend to cause lice and all the other troubles that you have in a hot environment with long hair, and it's not good for the creature. They'll tend to die off, and they tend to be short-haired dogs which tend to be yapping away in the middle of Africa when you're trying to sleep at night, which is what I found when you go to the middle of Africa. But so friends, there are ecological pressures which tend to separate out descendants into groups. That's not a problem. We understand that. But natural selection doesn't change one creature into another. It will just bring out certain characteristics. Great Danes only apparently people have told me that Great Danes, which are nice dogs, huge, whopping, great big dogs, but they tend not to actually be great long livers. They tend to die apparently at about 7 years. You might have a Great Dane, you'll tell me afterwards, which has lived to 90, but I just think it's highly unlikely. But you won't get a Pekingese from a Great Dane. You try it. You won't get it in 100 generations or 1,000 generations of dogs. You'll never do it. Because the information for large or smallness in that case is no longer, unless it's recessively held in the genetic and it's not a thoroughbred. But if it's a thoroughbred Great Dane, you won't get it. You see what I'm saying? So that's the artificial argument. It follows through into the natural selection argument. We'll leave that because we've just dealt with that. But so take Darwin looking at his finches in the Galapagos Islands in South America. He rightly observed that some finches have long beaks, some finches have short beaks, some finches seem to have very thick beaks, etc., etc., etc. But tell me, if this argument is true, which it may well be true, although people have actually found that there seems to be variation even in the islands over a period of time. But even if that argument is true, and I'm prepared to accept it, that they got separated geographically into different groups of finches in one island, different to another island, which has got slightly different temperature changes over the year, and different fruit is available on one island, different to another, and that has caused the favouring of one type of beak kind. Let me ask you the question. If that's true, and I'm prepared to accept that, what did the ancestor start off as? A finch. What did it finish off as? A finch. You've not changed the creature. All you've done is select from what was already there. And that is the point about natural selection. Some people have said, what about ring speciation? Getting a bit technical now, but some of you may have come across this in your classes at A-level or at university. It's an interesting point. I actually had this put to me at university recently, and I thought, well, I'll just go into this. And I thought, well, it really is not a problem. Ring speciation is just what it says. That one creature, which we'll look at just at this moment in time, is the grey-backed gull, which we call the herring gull, which has got red legs. And in our part of the world, in these islands, we also have the black-backed gull with yellow legs. Those two will not interbreed, right? It is noted that. So people say, this is forming a new creature. Is it? We'll see. When you actually work out what's going on, it's this grey-backed gull with red legs, which is very similar to one in North America. And these do interbreed. They fly across this line and they will tend to interbreed. Actually, if you go a little bit further down across America to Alaska, you come actually to a slightly different gull, which is now the Siberian gull, which we call the Vega gull, which no longer has red legs. They're prepared to put up with mates which have slightly different legs. Maybe, they find them attractive, I don't know. But, they actually do still mate together, even though things are now beginning to change. And then when you come across northern part of Russia, you find that things are getting a little bit different on the back of the gull. And the grey-backed gull, the Vega gull there, is now coming to a middle gull, which is more black in colour. And remember, it's no longer got the red legs. and it's got yellow legs. And then we come to ones in Scandinavia, which are definitely black-backed with yellow legs. And they, of course, are mating all together. They will mate there, they will mate there, and these will mate there until you come back to England and you find that they won't mate anymore. So they say, we formed a new creature. Have you? What did you start off with? Gulls. What did you finish with? Gulls. Is it common descent? No. It's just variation with the kind. Gulls. You've got differences in the gull creature. It's an example of natural selection. Fair enough. And the creationist has no problem with natural selection. But it's not new information. That's the crucial point. You're just selecting out of what was already there in Mendelian genetic theory. You're just simply selecting out of what is there in the genetic pool. But you've got a subset which is different to what was there in the ancestors. In the ancestral population, it would have been richer. But now it's slightly less rich, which is the trend. Creatures tend to be less rich in their descendants than they are in the ancestral kind. Well, let's move now to the next level, intricate mechanisms. Now, with intricate mechanisms, I'm going to take, first of all, a trilobite. I'm going to pass around one of your cousins. This is your 500 million year old cousin, if evolution is true. And you might just like to look at your dead ancestor. I will also take the time to pass around some of your other cousins. These were even older. These are the fish, which are still your cousins, so please treat them with care. These are fish fossils, but I'm not going to primarily talk about the fish. Suffice to say that the fish, we could actually look at those fossils and say, how did they form? Because the evidence of scales on them is so exquisite that it would suggest that they may have not got there by slow processes. In fact, they suggest strongly that they were buried quickly, catastrophically. But I want to major on trilobites. Trilobites, as you will see from your cousin being sent round, of course it's not, from my point of view, your cousin, but that's what evolution would have us believe. And they really do believe this. And we need to be aware that this is genuinely the position of the macro-evolutionary believer, a person who believes that mud left for 4.5 billion years eventually turned into people. That is the theory of evolution. That is what is being taught to our youngsters in schools. That is why, from the scientific point of view, I haven't even mentioned my Christian convictions, which of course are well known. But I'm saying just from the scientific point of view, is it genuine science to teach that position without teaching an alternative, which actually is just as sensible, if not more sensible, I would suggest to you. And the BBC is quite wrong to actually insist on only one side being heard. It is my contention that just on the grounds of good scientific debate, one ought to hear properly put the alternative arguments. And it's a growing body of scientists, who are not necessarily all Christians, by the way, who are not prepared to accept a hegemony on scientific teaching in our academic institutions, which says that only one side is taught. Evolution had its day for 150 years. But I believe that the grip of evolution is not as strong as it was, because people are genuinely realizing that there are scientific problems with this theory which haven't been answered. Even if you accept a very old Earth, which I'm going to show you in a moment, even if we accept that these trilobites are 500 million years ago, there are still big problems with the theory. And this is not put into our classrooms. We ought to have proper discussion where the evidence, as was prayed earlier, leads the discussion, not dogma. And I believe that's what's gone wrong in our society. We are led by an evolutionary dogma, not the evidence. I'm quite happy for evolutionists to put their position, and it should be put, because clearly it's a position which is the majority held in the country. So I recognize that in a democratic society, we must allow those who share that majority view to have their voice heard in the schools which are supported by the state. But it's quite wrong to suggest that that is the only way to look at the evidence. Now, as you consider this picture, you will see that the trilobites are actually very complicated, and that's the point of my showing this slide. The trilobites have eyes, but they have eyes not made of minerals, so not made of proteins like our eyes, but made of minerals. The mineral that the calcite, that the trilobite's eyes are made out of is actually calcite. I'm going to pass 2 bits of calcite along, and I'd like you to actually keep them together. And I'll tell you why, as if you just hold it in your hand, and I'll tell you what to do in a moment, right? And then each one of you can do it as you pass both of them around. Don't pass them around yet. I'll show you what to do in a moment. The trilobite has eyes made of calcite. Now, trilobites are in supposedly 500 million year old rock up to about 400 million year old rock. They start in the Cambrian and they go through into the Ordovician and even a little bit higher up sometimes as well. Trilobites are creatures which evidently walked along the sea floor. Their eyes were compound eyes. They are made of lots and lots of little lenses. Some of them have hundreds, others of them have thousands of these individual lenses. The lenses are made of calcite, calcium carbonate. Now, when you look at that what I've just given you, madam, when you look at that, you'll see exactly what this is on the screen, right? You'll see that there is a line on that yellow card, and it goes double, doesn't it? In the lights, you can see it going double. Now, when you put the other crystal on top, and you have to put the crystal such that it's not symmetrical, if you put it symmetrical, it will just make it worse. If you now turn it round, you will see that that double line becomes a single line. That represents what some trilobites, not all, have. They have what's called a double calcite lens. A single lump of calcite, and of course, and the eye of a trilobite is nowhere as big as that. Okay, this is just illustrating the principle. A single calcite crystal would cause a double image. Some trilobites have another calcite lens, a calcite crystal on top, which is twisted around 180 degrees, and it causes the double image to become single image again. This is meant to be simple. I suggest to you it's heavily complicated. The calcium carbonate is known also, if you, like any lens, if you actually form the lens into a special shape, which was found in the 1600s by Huygens and another gentleman, it was known that if you actually form lenses of this shape, you can actually get rid of the double image. So some trilobites have single calcite lenses where the lens is corrected for this double image just by shaping the lens. Others, and actually it's the ones in the Cambrian rock primarily, have lenses which are double calcite lens. Descartes and Huygens found this was the shape needed to actually make a lens see correctly in the 1600s. That was way before anybody ever found trilobites in the fossil record. Then people took out the lenses from these trilobites, and if you look at the trilobite that's going around, you'll find that you can't actually see the eyes, unfortunately, because trilobites which have eyes visible, like the slide that I just showed you, that one, they are worth thousands of pounds. Because to get them with the eyes still visible is a fantastic thing. We've got one at home, which is very small. We had to pay quite a lot of money. If you put it under a magnifying glass, you can actually see the lenses. Now, the great thing about this is that they are fossilized in the rock, and the calcite hasn't fossilized because it's just a mineral. So you can actually take out the calcite, put it in a laboratory, test it with a laser, and you find, wow, it's got this double calcite behavior. It's got double calcite lenses, or else it's got specially shaped single calcite lenses. And it shows to us that these creatures, far from being simple, were complex. An evolutionist has a big problem with what's called the Cambrian explosion. Given their timescale, which I don't accept personally, but just for a moment accepting their timescale, which says that this is over 600 million years, right? If you go to rock lower than this, you don't really find any significant fossils that you would say unequivocally are animals. You might find a bit of pollen in Precambrian rock that has been found, but you don't find animals. This is where you find the animal explosion in the fossil record. So-called because people are saying that life started here and gradually moved to man. Now, I don't accept that position personally, but just for the sake of argument, I'm saying just for the moment, I will take their millions of years and say, well, if this is supposed to be simple life, how come we've got no precursors in the fossil record showing trilobites struggling to make eyes? You don't. You've got trilobites with eyes ready to go, ready to see properly, and working incredibly efficiently. Now, friends, this is very important evidence in my mind that there is something wrong with the theory. It doesn't prove my case, and I can't say that I've proved it, because I'm just saying let the evidence lead. But I'm saying that the evidence, which is purported to be strong in favor of evolution, in many places is actually weak and fits much better with a creationist thesis, a creation thesis, which says that each of these creatures were made just as they are, but with variations, which I've already explained, which you're bound to get in any generation. Let's look at dragonflies. Now, I love dragonflies. I was looking at a book earlier talking about the British dragonflies. I think there are thousands, it's about 5,000 species of dragonflies, and we have about 38 in this country, and we've lost 3 in the last 50 years due to pollution, basically. So, interestingly, by the way, that's an important point. We're actually losing things, not gaining them. A lot of creatures are being lost. If evolution is true, we should be seeing things gaining, but we're not. We're seeing things losing. But let's just look at dragonflies. I've got something here to show you. This comes from a film by David Attenborough, when it comes up, which is about life in the undergrowth. And this life in the undergrowth is speaking about the fact that dragonflies start off as nymphs underwater. A dragonfly never goes back in again. And of course, a dragonfly has this intricate mechanism of delicate wings, just like any of these insects which fly, which if you touch the wing, it would be harmed immediately. Dragonfly fossils are found in the rock, and as you saw in this picture just below what I'm just about to press, the dragonfly impressions in the rock of a very delicate wing are all there. And in great evidence, by the way, that that creature didn't just lie there for millions of years and gradually get buried, because if you touch a wing, it disintegrates. When it's dead, it just sort of crumbles. The actual evidence in the rocks themselves shows to us, by the way, that these things haven't taken millions of years to form. But we'll accept the argument, just for the sake of argument, we'll accept that, right? We'll say, okay, let's take the evolutionary argument that this is over millions of years of development. Let's see what David Attenborough has to say. There are 2 things that I want to draw out from this video that we've just seen, which is well worth seeing in its entirety. Because although I don't agree with David Attenborough, he is courteous, and he does put his point, and he sticks to the facts. I don't agree with his interpretation, but he does make it plain, 2 points, that the dragonflies are exactly the same, except for size, in the rocks as the ones we have today. The other point, of course, to see is that the impressions are very, very clear of the wings themselves. There are actually a number of we'll keep to their reckoning on age, I don't accept it, but we'll call them very old ones. Here is one which is supposedly 320 million years old. This is way into the Carboniferous, and it's the oldest one in the Carboniferous, and you can still see the impressions of the wing. So what really this shows is that dragonflies, which are supposed to be, like all other creatures, enduring evolutionary change, are in fact showing evidence of stasis. They are exactly the same over all this period that there's supposed to have been some change. Now you can say, well, that just means that only some creatures were changing. But the trouble is this argument follows through for so many other creatures, like crocodiles, and other creatures which we see exactly the same in the fossil record as creatures that we have today. So I would suggest to you that actually the evidence fits far better with there being just something which is there in the record, which was bigger in the past, and that we essentially have it the same today, and it has not evolved. Well, let me just deal with the matter of freedom of inquiry. Many people say that we must only do science on this basis, that that's the physical world and natural sciences are done looking only at the physical world, which is fair enough, and I accept that. Science is essentially the study of physical mechanisms in the physical world. We don't invoke causes generally for something happening when we can see the obvious cause and effect relationship in the laboratory. However, when it goes way back into the past, where nobody was there to check up, and when you're talking about the origin of things itself, then I suggest to you that it is madness to suggest that that is the only way to look at origins, when clearly reality is more than just physics and chemistry. There are such things as mind and consciousness, which people have grappled with for centuries, but I don't think they will ever be able to show that mind arises from matter. That is one of the biggest questions that a materialist has. Where does his ability for rational reasoning come from? Because if he says that his ability for rational reasoning comes from the mud, then he's got to say, well, how do I know? And he's got no way of checking whether his rational reasoning is right or wrong. He hasn't got any basis for saying that what he's just thought is correct. You see, evolution is actually taught not because of the science. I would suggest to you it's following what this gentleman said way back in 1929 in Nature. He says the only alternative special creation is clearly incredible. In other words, it's driven by philosophical considerations, not by science. And it's a matter of presuppositions. Certainly for this gentleman, it's certainly presuppositions which is driving him, because he tries to find every reason for not using the word design, and when he has to, he says that it looks like design. He says biology. He makes this grand statement in his second book, The Blind Watchmaker. Richard Dawkins says biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Well, that may well be in his mind, but equally well, Philip Johnson, who is a lawyer, and you'd expect a lawyer to see the other side, he said, if you're going to teach the Darwinist view that organisms may look like they were designed but weren't, then you have to allow for the possibility that they look like they were designed because they were designed. Fair reasoning. Now, he's not a scientist, but he saw the illogicality of actually denying an alternative presupposition, which is to say, let's accept that there is a possibility of a wider reality. And when we look at Mount Rushmore, if we could argue till we're blue in the face and it could have been the winds and the waves, of an earlier ocean which carved out all the figures, but you know full well that that happened because some bloke, can't remember who he was, spent hours, if not days, if not weeks, months and years, actually carving out the figures of Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and all the others. And anyway, we can see it in the books that they look exactly like the same as them. So, a word about machines. The Darwinist cyclist might have a problem with a bicycle chain which only had some links in it, as this picture shows. It's quite an amusing one, really. To be of any use, machinery requires precision. If you're going to make a bicycle chain, you need the chain to be complete. You've got to have everything in place for that to work. So might I suggest to you that as we think about machines, coming to my last part of my talk, which is information, I need to deal with machines. Machines require precision, and a machine has function. There is precision and there is function. Let me use an analogy. I should have brought along a slinky toy that I have at home. Some of you will remember them, and I think they're still for sale in the shops. You know, a slinky toy where, you know, it goes downstairs and you've got this spring and you can make the spring do all sorts of things. Now, if you actually push the spring to one side, you're actually injecting some energy into it potentially, which when you let go, it's released. It's a bit like having potential energy in this pen, and when I let it fall, it drops. You're injecting energy into something. Now, it's not potential energy generally with machines, but I'm suggesting to you that a fairly tight definition scientifically of a machine, in the way that I'm going to use the word machine, is a device which raises the energy level such that when you let it go, it will do something, right? Now, at the biochemical level, the cell, as Richard Dawkins bluntly argued against me on Radio Northern Ireland last year, well, the cell's full of machines, he said. Well, of course it is, I know that. But a cell is full of machinery which has specific function. Each one of these parts of the cell is actually doing something very useful. Now, there is an important point, because some machines are actually there with a purpose of taking in energy. And you will not get a machine just simply by blasting the cell, which hasn't got a machine already, with lots of energy. Let me illustrate. Supposing we hadn't got this vital, necessary machine in the cell, which is the ATP motor. Now, biochemists amongst you will know that adenosine triphosphate, which is known as ATP, is absolutely essential to give you energy, basically a bit like the electric current which is going through my computer, right? Now, this is a machine for taking in the food which you eat every day and giving you energy to power all the parts of your body, even your brain and your mind and everything, okay? If you didn't have ATP running, you wouldn't have it. Now, supposing there was a point where ATP didn't exist, and evolution would say there is, right? Then you would have a problem. Because according to the theory of evolution, Professor Dawkins was telling me this on the radio, all you've got to do is just blast the sun onto that existing stuff, that mud, which has now got some replicator, he calls it, and it will produce an ATP motor. Will it? Not in 1,000 million billion years will it ever do so, because the laws of thermodynamics actually are against it. That if you've got random energy and you blast a room or some space with that random energy, if you don't have an existing machine to make something, it will not actually do anything at all. The energy has to be, and this is what the ATP motor actually does, it takes in energy and it converts it into useful energy, which can do things in the cell. In other words, it takes in the food in this case, and it converts it into energy which is transmitted carefully along pathways, chemical pathways, which are then used by other machinery in the cell and so on and so forth. Are you with me? So if you didn't have an ATP motor to begin with, you're never going to get an ATP motor just by blasting the proto cell, or whatever you're going to call it, with random energy from the sun. The laws of thermodynamics, and I have a whole talk on this, actually mitigate strongly against any such scientific nonsense. And to be frank, that's what it is. It's thermodynamic nonsense to say that machines, along the definition that I've just given you, which is a device for doing things, a functioning device which uses energy, those will not arise just by blasting it with random energy from the sun. An example would be a piano string. A piano has tension in it, right? You can measure the tension of the strings. Now, that is a machine, right? And it's a very useful machine. A piano can be used for all sorts of things. And of course, primarily for making music. But a machine for actually doing something useful, in this case, making music. But the tension in these strings is all at different levels, and that's very similar to what's happening in the DNA molecules in all living creatures. Let me use another illustration. If I took a frog, which is full of machines, just like any living creature is full of machines, and I put it into a blender, what would happen? Well, you'd get a bit of a mess. I think you'd agree. Would you be able to reassemble that poor frog? You might have all the parts, but you wouldn't get anywhere without intelligence, which is now leading me to my last point. Remember that point about machines? It's going to become pertinent. I now come to the cell again, and in the cell there is a DNA molecule, deoxyribonucleic nucleic acid, which carries on this, and it is actually a machine, along the definition I've just given you, because that deoxyribonucleic nucleic acid is held together by bonds which are actually raising the energy level at each point along that molecule, which acts as a double helix molecule. If you were to actually let that molecule go on its own without any other things around it, it would just disintegrate chemically. There is no chemical reason for the adenine here, or the adenine I should say, to actually join with thymine across the nucleotide bridge on DNA. There's no chemical-driven pathway to make those two come together, because you actually have to put energy in, a bit like that spring that I was referring to. You actually have to put energy in to make that bond come together. So the machinery of life actually cannot come together by just some random chemical fluctuations, because it never happens, friends. The science is actually all against forming DNA by some accidental process. But there's more, friends. On the DNA, it's the actual order of the nucleotide bonds. It's the order. We'll just take the left-hand one here, which is we've got cytosine, and then we've got thymine, and then we've got here adenine. So we've got, thymine, and then we've got thymine again. So you've got CTT, and that CTT is actually spelling out in coded form an instruction on the DNA to go and make something which will be a particular amino acid. And that amino acid is then joined with another one which will be formed by another triplet of letters, which will be CAT or GTC or whatever. And each of these is coding for a particular amino acid, and all these amino acids have to be all in the right place. And the simplest protein is, this is going too far to say 100. It's actually more like 1,000, if not millions for most proteins. The proteins are the stuff which make you, right? The proteins that make your eye. The proteins which make the keratin of your hair. Some of us have got still some, right? The proteins that make any part of your body are made according to DNA blueprints, which say go and get an amino acid, tag it onto this one, tag it onto the next one, and so on, and it goes all the way along, and it makes here, presto, it makes a protein. It's an incredible mechanism. There it is. GGA making that amino acid, CAT making that one, CTT making that one, and all these amino acids are all lined up. It's much more complicated than that, but this is the elementary bit, believe it or not, because actually shape becomes very important. And all these things are done according to coded instructions. In other words, what I'm saying to you, friends, is that you haven't just got chemistry and physics. You've got software. Software, where does it come from? The software in this computer. We've got a computer here which is made of lots of metal, plastic, all sorts of other stuff. Now, did the computer make the software which actually runs the computer? You'd be a fool to say that. Even I know that Bill Gates is living in Seattle. I feel like sort of duffing him up sometimes, when Windows crashes. But I know full well that Windows was made by a fleet of people who should know better, but they have actually sold me some software which sort of works. I mean, who would make software which, when you want to actually stop it, you have to press the start button? I mean, just get real. But anyway, we know all the problems with Windows. And I haven't had the courage yet to change to a Macintosh, even though I've got that name, right? But they have problems as well. But, this is the issue. Sitting on the matter is information. This is the Achilles heel of the whole theory of evolution. This is the one thing that no scientist is prepared to investigate properly without any prejudice in our academic institutions. They refuse to engage on this issue. Bill Densky and others have written huge volumes on this whole matter of information. There are many leading scientists who have actually had to lose their jobs because they are not allowed to challenge the reigning paradigm, both in America and in this country and in other places it's happened. Remember my earlier point that natural selection reduces the information base. If you had 10 billion years or 10 million years or any number of years, the direction of change is always downwards. You're always losing information. You're losing all the time. It's always richer in the earlier generations. Information, remember, I was saying, is neither matter nor energy. If you take a CD, does it weigh less or more when you put information on? The answer is, it doesn't weigh any different. Does it have more energy when it's got information on or less? No, we can't measure it by the energy. But it's got information. What's happened? Well, you've actually rearranged slightly the surface. But you can't work out just by that arrangement, just looking at it, that there is information on it. It's all to do with the means by which you read that information and you work out that there is something on it when you have the right machinery to read it. In other words, the message is sitting on the matter. If I see 22 in a lava lamp, I say, that's interesting. But if it happened tomorrow and it went to 23, I'd say, there's definitely something going on here. And if the next day it was 24 and a half, I'd say there's definitely something going on. In other words, you can know when information is being received. In fact, SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, actually put patterns in because you could see and you could recognize information by patterns. Such they were thinking that the little green men out there in the other side of the universe might actually pick up the signals and say, here guys, there's some people who are a bit intelligent down there on Earth. So you have a code. Now, you also have with that code a message which is sitting on the code. If John says that he loves Mary, he could have written it in French or in Chinese, or he could have written it in Japanese, but it would still be the same message using different codes. So there is many levels of information, and they all speak of an intelligent source. So there is two issues I just want to stress as I close. That the code is not the same as the material on which it's written. And, by the way, any information system is always sitting on machinery to actually raise the energy level in order to make those codes work in the machines that in the instruction level. So the DNA that I was referring to has these nucleotide bonds, right? Raised energy levels, bit like a computer at the machine level. There's a bit of information which has got a tiny little bit of energy raised, okay? And then there's the next bit along on the disk, the hard disk, has a slightly raised energy level, right? And the next one doesn't, right? And so it's either on or off, on or off, on or off, right? Okay, so it's a series of free energies, such that when you turn the computer off, it's gone. In the memory, that is, but on the hard disk, it's still there magnetically, or whatever storage mechanism you've got. And it's the same with DNA. The information is held by a free energy machine, tiny little molecular machine, which has a raised free energy. And it's the thermodynamics at the molecular level which is being driven, I suggest to you, by the information locking it to do what it does. Such that for an evolutionist to say that the chemistry is producing the information, frankly, it's nonsense. It's like saying that a computer hardware makes its own software. Not on. It's the software which drives the hardware, and it's that way round. Now we've got a real issue. If the code is actually organizing the material, and that's what I'm suggesting you is going on with DNA, then we've got another level which actually says that you could have used a different code, just like I was saying on that other illustration, English, French, Chinese, right? The message would have still been the same. If the creator had put in the DNA, a completely different code, he could have still got the same message, which was not CAT, but CTT goes away and makes a particular skin protein, right? And as long as we're consistent, it could have worked. So you see, the language is actually saying something the message is actually saying something which transcends the language. Computer programming doesn't come about by accident. Information implies intelligence there to put it, and intelligence implies a mind. And that is what evolution cannot grapple with. It cannot tell me where mind comes from. It cannot tell me where information systems come from. You remember I mentioned music and the piano earlier? Who made Schubert's great C major symphony? Did it come about by accident? Well, you can argue that. But what is that music? Is that music defined by the orchestra? No. Is it defined by the score that they're playing from? No. It's the music which was presumably in the mind of Schubert, which he then put down onto a code, which then organized in a conductor, organizing all the violins and all the rest of it, to play this incredible piece of music. And our ears are geared to actually listen to it. Music is a beautiful illustration of what really is going on at the molecular level. You see, just coming back to my piano, right? And that was the illustration we had before. Now, let's actually look at the piano in that way. If we looked at Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, which is one of my favorite pieces. Just put this down so you can hear it. The Nocturne was made by Chopin, obviously, and Intelegence produced a message which was coded with the musical staffs here, and then the matter is organized of the piano, and energy is given out such that we can listen to it. So in each of these illustrations, it shows to us that there is purpose, action, meaning, code, leading to the ability to actually listen. Now, friends, I suggest to you that language and code is not defined by matter. It cannot be. It transcends matter. I've also said to you that message transcends the code. It could be the same in a different language. And the intention behind the message speaks of intelligence. In a lecture in 1847, Faraday said this, and I end with this: "Therefore our philosophy, whilst it shows us these things, should lead us to think of him who hath wrought them. For it is said by an authority far above even that which these works present, that the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead." I suggest to you that contrary to what people realize or think today, that actually what this book says is consistent with good science. This book says that if we look at the world around us properly, it shows us that there is a mind, that there is an intelligence behind it. I would go further. I would say that it's foolish to think otherwise. If we try and think otherwise, we're actually undermining the whole basis of even rational thoughts. It's hardly surprising that in the Bible, in John's Gospel, it says, in the beginning was the Logos, which of course is the root of our word logic. In the beginning, and it's speaking of Christ, of course, was the logical principle behind everything. I suggest to you that all good science is actually pointing to a mind which is not only perfect, but has brilliantly brought together the created order. You might say, why is it spoilt? I might mention that right at the end. I hand over to time for questions. John, sorry it's been a bit long, but over for some questions, and then we'll round off.
I am speechless.